There's a moment, and most people have had it, even if they've never admitted it out loud, when you're standing at the exact edge of what you can afford to give. Not money, not time, not even effort. Yourself. You're running on fumes. Your boots are cracked at the sole. Your stomach's been answering questions your wallet can't. The world has taken from you steadily, quietly, the way a river takes sand, not all at once, not dramatically, just constantly, until one morning you wake up and realize there's less of you than there was last year. That's where Callum Dray was standing on the morning he walked past that bench. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't a hard man, not in the way people use that word to excuse cruelty. He was just empty in the particular way that poverty and grief and 3 weeks of sleeping in a livery stable will make a man empty. He had 43 cents, a bedroll, a name nobody in Tucson recognized, and a plan that was mostly just keep walking and see what happens. He wasn't looking for something to save. He wasn't looking for anything at all. And then he heard it, thin, desperate, high-pitched, the sound of a puppy crying in a way that was less bark and more please. I know what you're thinking. You've heard this kind of story. Man finds dog, dog saves man, everybody cries, fade to black. You think you know where this is going. You don't. Because what happened between that bench and the end of this story isn't a rescue. It's a reckoning. It's what happens when a man who has nothing left decides, against every sensible instinct, against his own survival, to give the last piece of himself away. And what that cost him, and what it gave back. Stay with this one, it earns it. I have kept a ledger since I was 11 years old. Not the financial kind, though Lord knows those have told their own miserable stories over the years. No, I mean the kind a man keeps in his head, the running tally of days and what they cost him, of trades made and losses absorbed, of moments he wishes he could unenter from the books. My mother started me on it, not intentionally. She used to say, Elias, you watch people the way a hawk watches a field. Someday that'll get you killed or make you a writer. She wasn't entirely wrong on either count. I never became a writer. I became a supply clerk for a freighting company out of El Paso, which is as close to watching people as you can get without being suspected of anything, but the ledger stayed. I was 34 years old and sitting on a wooden bench outside the territorial freighting office in Tucson on a Tuesday morning in late September when I first saw Callum Dray. I say first as if I knew then that I'd be seeing him again. I didn't. At the time, he was just one more man walking the main street in that particular way men walk when they're trying not to look like they need something. You learn to spot it after enough years of watching, the squared shoulders, the chin angle, the deliberateness of each step that's meant to broadcast purposeful but broadcasts, to the right kind of eye, desperate. He was tall, lean in a way that wasn't quite healthy, wearing a canvas coat that had started life as a good coat and had since made several bad decisions. His boots, I noticed the boots first, habit of mine. Boots tell the truth about a man's recent months faster than his face does, were cracked along the outside of the right sole, flapping slightly with every step in a way that must have been letting in the September dust. He wasn't young, wasn't old. 30, maybe 32, with a week's worth of beard and the kind of tan that comes from sleeping outside rather than working outside, which is a different kind entirely. He carried a bedroll strapped across his back and a canvas sack in his left hand that clinked faintly, not coins, I'd determine later, but a tin cup and a folding knife rattling against each other, those being essentially the sum of his portable assets. He was walking past me without seeing me. People like Callum Dray, people in that particular state of internal tunnel vision that prolonged hardship creates, they stop seeing the middle distances. They see the ground immediately ahead and the destination immediately ahead, and everything in between, including watchful supply clerks on benches, goes blurry. He would have walked right past the bench outside Headley's Feed and Grain, too. Except for the sound. I heard it half a second before he stopped. It was the kind of sound that operates below the level of conscious thought, small, sustained, rhythmically desperate. Not quite a whimper, not quite a yelp. Something in between, the audio equivalent of I am still here, I am still here, I am still here, repeated on an animal loop that had clearly been going on for longer than was healthy for either the animal producing it or the humans in earshot of it. Callum stopped. He didn't stop the way a man stops when he hears something charming. He stopped the way a man stops when something has reached through the fog of his own preoccupation and grabbed him by the collar. His left foot was still mid-step when his body arrested itself. The canvas sack swung forward slightly from momentum, the tin cup and knife doing their little clink and rattle, and then everything was still except the sound from under the bench. I watched him look down. Under the bench outside Headley's Feed and Grain, a bench that had been there since before the feed store, since before the street was properly laid, one of those civic fossils that accumulates rings of weather and human contact, someone had tied a rope to the bench leg. Thin cotton rope, maybe 3 feet of it, and at the other end of the rope was a puppy. Not a puppy in the charming sense, not the round, soft, fully fed puppy of someone's imagining. This was a puppy in the true and unglamorous sense. 7 or 8 weeks old at a guess, small enough to hold in 2 hands, with the disproportionate paws and oversized ears of a dog that would someday be significantly larger than it currently was. Shepherd mix of some variety, with the coloring of a thing that hadn't yet decided what color it was going to be, tawny and gray and a little white, all mixed together in a pattern that looked less designed than assembled from available parts. It was thin. Not starving thin, someone had been feeding it recently enough, but the rope had been tied tight enough around its neck to be uncomfortable, and it had clearly been under that bench for long enough to be frightened. It was sitting in the September dust, the rope pulled taut toward the bench leg, and it was making that sound at Callum Dray's cracked boot. Callum looked at the puppy for a long moment. The puppy looked back. There was no one around who appeared to own the animal. Headley's was open, I could see movement through the window, but no one had come out. No one on the street was paying attention to the bench. The puppy had been there, I'd later understand, since before I arrived that morning, which meant at least 40 minutes of rope and dust and that sound, unattended. Callum crouched down. Not dramatically, not the way a man crouches when he's performing kindness for an audience. He crouched the way a man crouches when his body moves before his brain has finished the argument. He set his canvas sack down in the dust and lowered himself onto his haunches, and he looked at the puppy from the new elevation, and the puppy looked back at him with the enormous, unguarded attention that animals give to things they have decided to trust. I watched Callum's face change. I've kept my ledger long enough to know what that particular change looks like. It's not a softening. That word makes it sound gentle, and it isn't, not exactly. It's more like something relaxing that has been held rigid for a very long time. The set of his jaw, which had been carrying what I can only describe as the structural tension of a man holding himself together through will rather than ease, it shifted. His eyes changed register. Not teary, not sentimental, just present. Suddenly, completely present in a way he hadn't been half a minute ago. He extended one hand, slowly, palm up. The puppy sniffed it. Then the puppy's tail moved, not the full, wild wag of a happy animal, but a careful, tentative oscillation, the tail of an animal that has been uncertain long enough to be cautious about certainty. Callum let out a breath, long, slow, the kind of breath a man lets out when he has been holding it without knowing. "Hey," he said to the puppy, very quietly. "Hey, small one. I am going to tell you something about Callum Dray that he would not have told you himself, not in those early hours, possibly not ever. I learned it incrementally, the way you learn most true things about a person, not through declaration but through accumulation of small evidence, the ledger-keeping method applied to a human being." Callum had come to Tucson from the northeast corner of the New Mexico territory, where he had, until 6 weeks prior to this morning, been a ranch hand on a spread called the Ocotillo Cross. He had worked that ranch for 4 years, which was not a short tenure for a man in his profession. 4 years in one place means something, means roots, means relationships, means a version of home. He'd arrived with nothing and had built incrementally a life that fit him. He knew the other hands by their habits and their weaknesses and their occasional generosities. He knew the cook's schedule and the owner's moods and which section of fence was going to need replacing before winter. He had a horse, not his horse, the ranch's horse, but a sorrel gelding he'd named Cormorant in a private moment that he'd never told anyone about because ranching men don't name horses they don't own. But he'd named it anyway, quietly, the way you claim things when you have nothing officially to claim. And then the Ocotillo Cross went under. Drought year compounded by a bad decision the owner had made 3 years earlier that was now coming due, and the ranch folded with a speed that left Callum and 4 other hands, and the cook, standing in the yard on a Thursday morning with their pay through the prior week and no job. The cook went to her sister in Albuquerque. 2 of the hands had families they could return to. One drifted east. And Callum, who had no family to return to and no particular east to drift toward, went west, because west was where the work was supposed to be, according to the particular mythology that sustains men without options. He'd been walking and working odd jobs and not finding what he was looking for, not even sure what he was looking for 6 weeks. He had 43 cents. The cracked boot had been cracked for 2 weeks, and he had not had the money to have it repaired, which meant every step in it was a reminder, a small repeated notification from the universe that he was behind. He had, in 6 weeks, not touched another living thing with any tenderness. I don't say that to make you feel a particular emotion about it. I say it because it's relevant, because it means something, because the body keeps a ledger too, and his was noting the deficit. And so when the puppy pressed its nose against his palm, that small, warm, specific pressure of an animal choosing to trust, something in Callum Dray's internal accounting registered it as significant. He didn't make a decision, not then. He just stayed crouching, one hand near the puppy, for a long time. I watched for a while, then I went back to my own business, which was waiting for the freight manifest that was supposed to arrive by 11. The manifest was late. I ate the biscuit I'd brought from the boarding house. The morning settled into its middle hours with the particular Tucson quality of heat that is less fierce in September than July, but still fully committed to reminding you it's there. At some point, maybe an hour after Callum had crouched down, maybe less, I noticed he was still there. Not crouching anymore, sitting, on the ground in the dust with his back against the bench leg and the puppy curled in his lap. The puppy was asleep. Callum was not asleep. He was looking at nothing in particular, his hands resting on the small, warm weight in his lap with a deliberateness that was both protective and confused, as if he was not entirely sure how he'd arrived at this position and was still running calculations on whether to disrupt it. I've seen that expression on men before. It's the expression of someone who has unexpectedly received something they needed and can't quite figure out what to do about the receiving. A man came out of Headley's eventually, around 11:15, a heavy-set fellow in a leather apron who moved with the particular confidence of someone who owns the property he's standing on. He looked at Callum. He looked at the puppy. Something complicated moved across his face. "That your dog?" he said. Callum looked up. "No," he said, "it was tied here." "Yeah," said the man, who I'd later learn was not Headley himself but his son-in-law, a fellow named Garrett Pulse. "Tied here since this morning. Owner left it." A pause. "Left it," Callum repeated, flat, not a question. "Didn't want it, too many already, I guess. Just tied it up and walked off." Garrett Pulse shrugged in the way people shrug when they want you to understand that they also find something unfortunate, but have decided not to be the one responsible for it. "Was going to have someone take it out of town tonight." The phrase "take it out of town" landed in the air between them with the specific weight of a phrase that means something else entirely. Callum looked down at the puppy. "I'll take it," he said. Garrett Pulse looked at him, looked at the bedroll, looked at the canvas sack, performed the same calculation that I'd performed when I'd first seen Callum walk past, the inventory of a man whose circumstances were visible. "You sure about that? Not unkind, exactly. Honest in the way people are honest when they think they're doing you a favor." Callum had 43 cents. He had a cracked boot. He had no job, no address, no animal feed, and no particular plan beyond West. Every practical consideration aligned on one side of the ledger. "I'll take it," he said again. He untied the rope from the bench leg. It took him a minute because the knot had pulled tight. The puppy had been straining against it long enough to cinch the rope down, and Callum's fingers were not especially nimble in the manner of a man who has been cold and undersupplied for weeks. He worked at it patiently, without cursing, without rushing, with a focused gentleness that seemed to cost him some concentration. When the rope came loose, the puppy woke up, looked around, looked at Callum, tail, tentative oscillation becoming gradually more committed. Callum picked the puppy up with both hands, tucked it against his chest, stood up, collected his canvas sack and his bedroll. He looked around the street. I had been watching this entire time from my bench, which was approximately 30 feet away, and I want to be precise about what his face showed in that moment. Not happiness, not quite, not in any clean or simple way. What it showed was something, a quality of aliveness that had not been present when I'd first seen him walk past, like a lamp that has been burning very low and has had its wick adjusted, still the same lamp, same flame, but more of it visible. He started walking. I don't know what made me stand up and follow. Professional curiosity, the ledger keeper's compulsion, or something else, something harder to categorize. But I found myself falling into step about 20 yards behind Callum Dray as he walked down the main street of Tucson with a puppy tucked against his chest, its paws braced on his forearm, its head up, watching the world go past with the wide-eyed vacancy of a creature that has decided, based on available information, that this is better than the alternative. He went to Navarro's dry goods first. I stayed outside, but I could see through the window. He put the puppy on the counter. It stood there wobbling, offended by the surface, and he spoke to old Navarro, and there was an exchange that involved Callum reaching into his pocket and producing his coins and Navarro producing something small. A paper bag. Some kind of foodstuff, dried, the cheapest thing in the shop by the look of the exchange. He came out, tore a small piece off whatever was in the bag, and fed it to the puppy, which consumed it with the desperate earnestness of a creature that has been operating on anxiety rather than calories for too long. He had spent some number of those 43 cents. I did the arithmetic on what you could buy at Navarro's for the minimum possible outlay and came up with not much. Certainly not enough to feed a dog for more than a few days. He walked on. I should explain why I kept following him. The honest answer is, I didn't know. But the ledger keeper's answer, the retrospective answer that makes more coherent sense, is this. I had been watching people walk past that bench all morning, and not one of them had stopped. A dozen people had walked past that sound, that small, desperate sound, and they had all performed the same mental arithmetic. Asterisk, not my problem, not my dog, I'm busy, I have my own, and kept walking. Which is not a condemnation, it's a fact. It's what people do, especially in a town that has enough of its own hardship that there's no surplus left over for stray animals. But Callum Dray, who had less than anyone I'd seen walk past, had stopped. He had stopped and crouched down. He had sat in the dust. He had given the last of some small sum of money for a paper bag of dried food. He had made a decision that was, by any measure of practical self-interest, the wrong decision. And I wanted to understand it. Not judge it, not pity it, understand it. Because the ledger keeper's instinct is not to evaluate but to comprehend, and what I was watching, a man with nothing giving what he didn't have, was the kind of thing I had been watching people fail to do my entire adult life, and the fact that someone was actually doing it felt like it required documentation. So I followed. The afternoon went like this. Callum walked to the far end of the commercial district, where the street widened into the flatter, dustier zone of the stockyards, and the livery and the various structures that serve the practical functions of a frontier town without being the kind of thing a town puts in a newspaper column. He stood for a while at the fence of one of the corrals, watching the horses, the puppy settled in the crook of his left arm like it had always lived there. He was not performing comfort. He was just giving the animal a place to be that wasn't a bench, and the animal was taking it without comment. He spoke to a man at the livery, one of the hands, a broad-shouldered Tohono O'odham man named Ven, who I knew slightly from my freight work. There was a conversation. I watched rather than heard it. Ven looked at the puppy, looked at Callum, said something, and Callum nodded. After a moment, Ven disappeared into the livery and came back with a clean grain sack and a length of cord, and there was an exchange. I couldn't see what Callum gave in return, if anything, and Callum fashioned, slowly and with some experimentation, a kind of rough sling from the grain sack that let him carry the puppy against his chest with both hands free. It was not a good sling. It had the structural integrity of a solution improvised from available materials by someone who has never made a dog sling before and is working from first principles. But the puppy, after a moment of evaluation, settled into it, and Callum adjusted the cord across his shoulder, and the whole arrangement held. He went back to the main street. He stood outside the freight office, my freight office, or rather my employer's freight office, for a moment, reading the notice board. I came up beside him. "That's fresh," I said, pointing to a posting near the bottom. "Just went up today." He looked at me, calibrating. I'm not a threatening figure, 34, spectacles, ledger book under my arm at most hours, the general bearing of a man whose danger to others is primarily rhetorical. And after a moment he looked back at the board. "Wagon work," he said. "Supply run to the San Pedro relay station," I said. 3 days there and back." They want 2 men, 1 driver, 1 loader. Pay is $1.50 each way. I paused. It's not glamorous work. He was quiet for a moment, then dogs aloud. I blinked. Then I looked at the puppy in the grain sack sling, which looked back at me with the comprehensive blankness of a creature that has recently eaten a piece of dried food and is therefore broadly content with the universe. I can ask, I said. I asked. My employer, a pragmatic man named Birch Calloway who had opinions about very little except the reliable movement of goods, said he didn't care about the dog as long as it didn't bite the mules. I reported this. Callum was hired. He started the next morning. That evening, the evening of the day I'd watched him pick up the puppy, he slept in the livery, which was where Ven had told him he could sleep in exchange for 2 hours of work on the fences. The puppy slept in the grain sack sling, which Callum had hung from a nail, so the animal was suspended in a kind of improvised hammock beside where he lay in the straw. I know this because I came back to pick up a manifest I'd forgotten, and I saw them through the open livery door. Callum on his side in the straw, eyes closed, one hand resting near, not touching, but near the sack where the puppy slept. The puppy's breathing was visible, the small rhythmic rise and fall of an animal that has decided, against recent experience, that the current situation is safe. I noted it in my ledger. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't at all, but because it was the kind of image that the ledger keeper in me recognized as significant without being able to yet explain why. A man who had nothing, a puppy who had been left, both of them in the straw, doing the difficult ordinary work of trusting a new situation. That's how it started. What I didn't know then, what I'd only learn in pieces over the following days, was what Callum was thinking, lying in that straw, not quite asleep, hand resting near the grain sack hammock. He wasn't thinking about the puppy, not exclusively. He was thinking about Cormorant, the sorrel gelding he'd named in secret at the Ocotillo Cross. About the morning the ranch had folded, and he'd led Cormorant back to the stable, and unbuckled the saddle blanket he'd always used and left it hanging on the peg and walked away, and how Cormorant had watched him go with the equine blankness that is either the great mercy or the great cruelty of horses, depending on what you need from them at that moment. He was thinking about what it costs a person to let themselves attach to something they can't afford to lose. He'd done the math 6 weeks ago standing in that yard. He'd looked at the math and arrived at a clean, if joyless, conclusion. Keep moving, keep the accounts simple, don't acquire things you'll have to leave behind. It was a sound conclusion. The problem, the specific, irreducible problem, was that he'd heard a puppy crying under a bench, and his body had moved before the conclusion could stop it. And now he was lying in the straw with 43 cents minus whatever he'd spent at Navarro's, and a puppy in a grain sack hammock, and a job starting tomorrow. He hadn't named it yet. He was very deliberately not naming it. Naming it would mean something. He wasn't sure he was ready for what it would mean. He woke before dawn, fed the puppy the remainder of what he'd bought at Navarro's, drank water from the livery trough. He'd found a tin cup in his sack, which I'd noted, and presented himself at the freight office at the specified hour, puppy in the grain sack sling, bedroll on his back. The other driver was a man named Ortega, 50s, mustache of the particular density that becomes a statement, who looked at the puppy and said nothing, which in Ortega's vocabulary meant neither approval nor disapproval but a provisional suspension of judgment, which was more than most men offered. They loaded the wagon. I watched them go. 3 days, I told myself. $1.50 each way, so $3 total if he made both legs. That was nearly enough to fix a boot. That was something. I noted it in the ledger. C. Dray departed for San Pedro Relay. Puppy in grain sack, 43 cents minus Navarro's, $3 pending. Then I went back to my manifest, because a man can only follow so much of someone else's story before his own work reasserts its claim. But the ledger stayed with me. The specific arithmetic of Callum Dray stayed with me. The number of things he didn't have, the one small thing he'd picked up anyway, the decision that made no practical sense and that he had made with his body before his brain could weigh in. I've spent years watching people walk past things they could have helped, tallying the small daily choices that add up to what a person is, and I had never had a clear answer for why some people stop and some people don't, why some people look at the math and do it anyway. Callum Dray left Tucson that morning with a puppy he couldn't afford, a wage he hadn't earned yet, and a boot that was still cracked. But he left, and that, I thought, watching the wagon go, is a different kind of arithmetic entirely. The kind that doesn't fit neatly in a ledger, but that has to be entered somewhere. That matters in the accounting of things, even when you can't say exactly what column it belongs in. The dust settled behind the wagon, the street resumed. And somewhere in the back of that wagon, a small dog in a grain sack sling was watching the town of Tucson disappear behind it, having no opinion whatsoever about the direction of travel, concerned only with the warmth of the chest it had decided to belong to. The San Pedro Road doesn't forgive inattention. I know it well enough. I've ridden it twice in the course of freight work, which is 2 more times than most people do it voluntarily. And what it does, specifically, is convince you in the first miles that it's manageable. The terrain is flat enough, the saguaro spread out on either side in that austere desert architecture that looks almost meditative in early morning light, the air carrying the cool residue of night. You think, this isn't so bad. I can see where I'm going. Then the road begins its series of quiet disagreements with you. Callum told me about the second day, later in pieces, the way people report things they haven't entirely processed yet. He'd taken the first overnight at the halfway camp, a rough stopping point, a stone fire ring and a linta held together more by optimism than engineering, and had slept badly, not from discomfort, but from the particular alertness of a man with something to protect. The puppy had woken 3 times in the night, not in distress, but in the mildly demanding way of a young animal that has located a safe situation and is now pushing its understanding of the boundaries. Each time it woke, Callum woke. Each time it settled, he settled, though never completely. He looked, by Ortega's account, like a man who had been awake most of the night for reasons he couldn't explain to another man without sounding either soft or strange. Ortega, who had children and understood the sleep deprivation of responsibility, said nothing about this, which was its own form of generosity. The second day, the road changed. They were 2 miles short of the San Pedro relay station when the left rear wheel found the particular rock that had clearly been placed on that road by some geological process with a grievance. The wagon lurched. Ortega caught the mules. The wheel didn't break. It was a sturdier wagon than that, but something in the axle assembly gave a sound that both men recognized as the sound of a thing that is going to need attention before it gets worse. Ortega climbed down and looked at it. Callum climbed down behind him, puppy in the sling. "Cracked bearing," Ortega said, the flat declarative of a man who has seen this before and is now calculating the damage. They were 2 miles from the station. The wagon was loaded. The mules were neither injured nor panicked, which was the best available news. The cracked bearing was the worst, because a cracked bearing left unaddressed becomes a broken bearing, which becomes a wagon that goes nowhere. "I'll walk ahead," Callum said. "Station'll have tools." Ortega looked at him. 2 miles. "I can see that. In this heat." The heat had arrived by then, the September midday heat, which is a different animal from its July form, but is still fully capable of making a man reconsider his choices. Callum was already out of water. He'd given the puppy what remained of his canteen's water that morning, doing the mental arithmetic incorrectly in the direction of "we'll be at the station by noon," which was still true, but had not accounted for the rock and the axle. "I'll be fine," Callum said. "Your dog need water," Ortega said, meaning you need water. "I'll be fine," Callum said again and started walking. "I am going to pause here and tell you something about the particular quality of the San Pedro Basin in the heat of the day. It is the kind of heat that operates on principle. It doesn't merely warm you, it instructs you. It reminds you in slow, persistent terms that you are a creature with a body that has requirements, and that the landscape around you has none of those requirements and therefore cannot be bargained with. The saguaro manage it because they are built for it. The quail manage it because they know where the shade is. The man walking 2 miles with a puppy in a grain sack sling manages it by putting one foot in front of the other, and not thinking about the water situation too directly. Callum had walked further distances in worse conditions. He'd walked out of the Ocotillo Cross 6 weeks ago and had walked, on some days, 8 and 10 miles between one temporary situation and the next, sleeping where he could, eating when he could, managing the basic arithmetic of mobility. He was not a fragile man, and he did not think of himself as one. But a cracked boot on a rocky road in September heat is a specific and cumulative misery. The gap in the right soul had widened in the days since he'd taken the job, and now with every step it admitted not just dust but small, sharp fragments of the road's surface itself, working their way in and redistributing themselves across the ball of his foot with the diligent irritation of things that cannot be addressed until later. He walked. The puppy in the sling was quiet. It was old enough to read the situation, or seemed to be, in the way that dogs seem to develop a preternatural sensitivity to their person's internal state within the first few days of association. It lay in the sling without squirming, its head resting on Callum's forearm, eyes half closed against the glare, breathing steadily in the rhythm of an animal that has decided the appropriate response to the current conditions is to remain calm and let the large creature handle it. Callum talked to it while he walked. Not conversation, exactly, not the self-conscious monologue of a man who knows he's being observed. This was quieter than that, intermittent, the words of a man who has been in his own head so long that a small, warm presence has become the thing he directs his inner voice toward. "Almost there," he said at one point. "Then it'll be fine. Then, after a long stretch of nothing, you need a name." The relay station at San Pedro was a modest establishment by any measure. A stone building, a small corral, a well, a fellow named Augusto who managed the station for the territorial freighting company and had the slightly baked quality of a man who has spent enough years in the desert to have made a durable peace with it. Callum arrived at the station covered in dust, limping slightly from the boot, with the puppy in the sling and the look of a man who has been arguing with the landscape and has reached a provisional draw. Augusto gave him water first, then looked at the puppy. "How old?" he said. "Don't know exactly. 8 weeks maybe." Augusto handed him a second cup of water and a tin bowl for the puppy, and Callum set both down in the shade of the station wall, and the puppy drank with the single-minded efficiency of an animal that understands the value of what's being offered. They talked about the axle. Augusto had tools, and he had a spare bearing component in the station stores. One of the things a relay station accumulates over years is the specific hardware that breaks at inconvenient moments, and he sent one of his 2-station hands back with Callum to assist Ortega with the repair. It took the rest of the afternoon. Callum worked on it. He was not a wheelwright, but he understood mechanical logic. Ranch work demands a generalist relationship with anything that breaks, and he worked alongside Augusto's man on the bearing, the afternoon heat pressing down on them, both of them sweating into the project with the focused silence of men engaged in something that needs to be right. The puppy lay in the shade nearby, watching. At some point in the afternoon, Callum placed it around 3 when the heat had started its gradual retreat. The puppy got up from its spot and walked over and lay down directly beside him while he worked. Not in front of him, not demanding attention, just beside, one small paw on his boot, the cracked one. He noticed, he said nothing. But I know from what he told me later that he felt it. The small specific weight of that paw on the cracked boot, the casual, uncomplicated claim of it, a puppy saying in the only language available to it, "I'm here. I picked you." That was when he named it. Not out loud, not then, but in his head, which is where things become real before they become spoken, he named it Reed. Later, when I asked him why Reed, he thought about it for a moment and then said, "It bends. In the water, you know, a reed bends with it but doesn't break." I wrote it in the ledger. The repair took until near sundown. They made the station with the wagon intact, the mules cooperative, the bearing holding. Augusto fed them beans and cornbread and a dried meat that asked no questions and answered none, and they slept at the station, Callum in the bunk with Reed curled against his side, which was an elevation from the grain sack hammock, and seemed to be received by the puppy as an appropriate acknowledgement of the relationship's development. The return journey started the next morning. It was on the return journey that Callum met the man who would change the arithmetic. His name was Silas Wren, and he was camped beside the road about 4 miles out of the relay station, in the way that a man is camped when camping is not a choice he has made so much as a situation he has arrived at. He was 60 or thereabouts, lean and weathered in the permanent way of a man who has been weathered so long it has become his natural condition, with a hat that might once have been black and was now the color of things that have absorbed decades of desert sun. He had a mule, one mule, not two, hitched to a wagon that was smaller and worse appointed than Callum's freight wagon in every measurable way. The mule was standing. The man was sitting on the ground beside the rear wheel, which had a problem of its own. Not a bearing problem, a spoke problem. One of the rear wheel spokes had snapped, and without it the wheel had an opinion about its structural integrity that did not align with its intended function. Callum told Ortega to stop. Ortega stopped. Callum got down with Reed in the sling and walked over to the old man. "Spoke," Callum said. Silas Wren looked up. He had the eyes of someone who has spent a long time assessing whether people are worth trusting and has mostly concluded they aren't, but retains, despite everything, the capacity to be surprised. He looked at Callum. He looked at the puppy. "Spoke," he confirmed. "We might have something in the wagon," Callum said. They didn't have a spoke. The freight wagon's spare parts inventory was not that comprehensive. But Ortega, who had been doing this run for 11 years and knew the territory's particular mechanical sense of humor, had a length of hardwood in the wagon that was not a spoke, but could, in the hands of someone with patience and a decent knife, become a temporary spoke. Not a good one. Not a spoke that would get Silas Wren wherever he was going without eventually needing a real replacement, but a spoke that would get him to Tucson. Callum spent an hour and a half on it, working the wood with his knife and Ortega's small rasp, shaping it to the approximate dimensions of the broken spoke, with the focused deliberateness of a man for whom this kind of problem-solving is not unfamiliar. Silas Wren sat nearby, watching, saying little. Reed sat in Callum's sling throughout. At one point Silas Wren said, "That your dog?" Callum was focused on the wood. "Yes," he said. "Not I found it, not I'm looking after it, yes." They fitted the temporary spoke, tested the wheel, determined it would hold for the distance. Silas Wren stood up. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the wheel, then at Callum. He put his hand in his coat pocket and produced something, a coin, from the look of it, and held it out. Callum looked at it, then looked at the man. "Keep it," he said. Silas Wren looked at him, the assessment in those eyes that had been calibrating trust for 60 years. "You need it," he said, not accusatory, factual. "So do you," Callum said. "Keep it." Another silence. Silas put the coin back. "Where are you headed?" he said. "Tucson." "And after that?" Callum was quiet for a moment. "Haven't gotten there yet." Silas Wren nodded. He had the quality of a man who has heard that answer enough times to know what it means and what it doesn't mean. He looked at Reed again. "Dog needs food," he said. "I know." "I've got a sister in Tucson," Silas said. "Runs a boarding house on the East End, tolerates animals, rates reasonable." He said the name, he said the street. "Tell her Silas sent you. She'll give you a week on credit if you tell her the situation." Callum looked at him. The thing behind his eyes, the ledger, the running tally, the account of what he could and couldn't afford, was doing something complicated. "You don't know me," he said. "No," Silas said. "But you stopped." He said it simply, without sentiment, as if it were merely a fact about the world. You stopped. As if stopping were a quality that indexed a person, as if it were sufficient information. Callum picked up his sack, collected Ortega, and they continued toward Tucson. The return journey took the remainder of that day. They arrived in Tucson in the early evening, the September light going long and amber across the main street, the heat stepped back enough to be almost kind. Ortega collected his pay. Callum collected his, $3. He stood on the street with $3 and a dog named Reed and the name of a boarding house on the East End, and he did the arithmetic. The boot repair would cost 50 cents, maybe 75. A week at the boarding house on credit would need to be paid back. Reed needed proper food, not the emergency rations of dried scraps from Navarro's. He needed a second job, or a longer one, or something that would stabilize the numbers past the next 10 days. He was working the math when I found him. I'd been watching for the wagon. I told you I kept the ledger. Some part of me had been tracking Callum Dray's story as a separate entry since the morning on the bench. The way you sometimes pick up a thread of someone else's accounting and can't put it down. "How was the road?" I said. He looked at me. He had the dust of 3 days on him, and the particular quality of a man who has been outside long enough to have gone somewhere internally that's harder to describe than physical distance. Reed was in the sling, awake, looking at me with the comprehensive suspicion of a dog that is new to the world and not yet decided about clerks. Road was fine, he said. Axel had opinions. Fixed. Fixed, he shifted Reed in the sling. Do you know a boarding house on the East End? Woman runs it, sister of a man named Silas Wren. I knew it, knew of it specifically. I'd sent 2 of our freight drivers there in the past. Reliable establishment, the kind that doesn't ask too many questions and doesn't need to, because the people who end up there are generally straightforward about their circumstances. I can show you, I said. We walked, Callum and I and Reed in the sling, through the amber evening of Tucson, and I told him about the other jobs on the board, the ones that weren't 3-day runs but longer engagements, the cattle drives that were forming up for the season's end, the construction work at the new relay post to the south. He listened without interrupting, which is the quality of listening I respect most, the kind that is actually receiving information rather than waiting for the space to speak. At some point he said, "Do you always follow people?" And I thought about it. I thought about the ledger, about the hawk in the field, about my mother's prediction. I said, "Sometimes I follow a story I can't make sense of." He looked at me sideways. Then unexpectedly he smiled. It was brief, partial, and it rearranged his face into something I hadn't seen before, something younger or older, I couldn't quite determine which. "What's there to make sense of?" he said. I looked at Reed. "That's what I'm working on," I said. The boarding house was run by a woman named Cora Wren Marsh, which is the kind of name that manages to communicate both practicality and history simultaneously. She was somewhere in her 50s, with the particular efficiency of a woman who has run a business by herself long enough to have eliminated all unnecessary motion from her daily operations. She looked at Callum. She looked at Reed. "Silas," she said. "San Pedro Road," Callum said, spoke. She absorbed this. "He's all right. He'll be in Tucson tomorrow, maybe. Wheel should hold." She looked at the dog again, then at Callum. "Week on credit," she said. "Then you pay or you work it off. I've got fencing needs doing in the back." "Fair," Callum said. She showed him the room. It was small in the honest way of rooms that have never been anything but small and have made their peace with it, a cot, a washstand, a window that faced the yard. Clean, functional. The kind of room that doesn't ask anything of you, except that you sleep in it and leave it approximately as you found it. Callum set his sack down, lifted Reed out of the sling and set the dog on the floor. Reed stood on the bare boards, looked around, found a corner that apparently met its requirements, and sat down in it with the authority of an animal establishing a position. Callum looked at the room, then sat down on the cot. He had $3. He had a roof for a week on credit. He had a dog named Reed. He had a cracked boot that needed fixing and a list of jobs that might or might not materialize and a ledger that was still, by any conventional measure, running a deficit. But he had stopped. He had stopped on the road when Silas Wren needed a spoke. He had stopped on the main street when a puppy needed someone to notice it. He had made both decisions against the arithmetic, against the clean conclusion of keep moving, keep the account simple. And the road so far had answered him. Not generously, not dramatically, not with the sweeping reversal of a man whose luck turns all at once. Just incrementally. Just a name, a roof, $3 a direction. He took off his boots, looked at the cracked sole. "Tomorrow," he said to himself, to the room, or possibly to Reed, who had curled up in the corner with an air of complete satisfaction. "Tomorrow we fix that." The boot got fixed on the second day. I know because Callum came by the freight office that morning. I had, by then, semi-officially adopted the habit of being somewhere he could find me, on the grounds that I was following the story and the story required proximity, and his step was different. The flap was gone. Both boots now performed their intended function without editorial commentary, and the change in his bearing was subtle but real. Something in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his walk, that small unconscious confidence a man carries when his body is not constantly broadcasting a deficiency. Reed was in the sling. He'd learned in the days since Tucson that the sling needed modification. The grain sack had not been designed for a dog that was actively growing. And Reed had developed, in the way of dogs given regular food and consistent warmth, a noticeably more substantial physical presence than the original sack had anticipated. Callum had reworked it with a better length of canvas, borrowed from the boarding house stores with Cora's permission, and the new arrangement had the quality of something made by someone who has done a thing wrong once and has now done it correctly. He asked about the work board. I walked him to the board. He read carefully, the way a man reads when the decisions matter, and asked about 2 postings. One was the construction job to the south, which would pay steadily for 3 weeks and would accommodate a dog. One was a cattle drive forming up out of the Maricopa stockyards, which was longer, harder, better paid, and also accommodated dogs in the way that cattle work generally does, because dogs are useful on a drive, and no foreman who has spent time in the territory is going to turn away a useful thing. He took the construction job. Not because it was more money, the drive paid better over time. He took it because it kept him near Tucson for 3 weeks, and because he had a debt to Cora Wren Marsh, and because there was something else, something he mentioned in passing that I entered in the ledger immediately because it had the quality of a thing that mattered. "I want to see how she does in a place," he said. He'd slipped. He'd been calling Read It consistently since I'd first met him, in the careful way of a man managing his attachments. I noted it. I said nothing about it. The construction work was at a new relay station being built about 6 miles south of Tucson, a territorial project that was behind schedule and overstaffed with men of varying commitment levels, which is the particular ecology of construction projects in territories where labor is inconsistent. Callum fit in without friction. He was a reliable worker, the kind who shows up when he says he will and does the task without requiring supervision or entertainment. And construction foremen respond to this the way thirsty men respond to water, with a gratitude that is not quite articulate but is functionally expressed in the form of steady assignment. Reed lived at Cora's during the work days. This was Cora's arrangement, not Callum's request. She had, in the way of practical women who will not admit to softening, determined that the dog could not spend all day in a sling at a construction site without certain developmental disadvantages, and that her yard was an adequate alternative, and that she would not charge extra for this, and that this was a business decision rather than anything sentimental, which no one believed but everyone respected. Reed, for her part, appeared to experience the yard with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a dog, discovering that the world is significantly larger than a bench and a sling and a livery stable. Cora reported, in the same dry register in which she reported everything, that the dog had systematically investigated every corner of the yard, had developed an opinion about the fence posts, and had twice attempted to tunnel under the gate, which was ambitious if strategically misguided. Callum came back to the boarding house each evening. Reed learned the sound of his boots, the new, whole, properly soled boots on the wooden porch, and by the 3rd or 4th day had developed the habit of being at the door before he opened it. Cora saw this and said nothing. It was the kind of thing that doesn't need to be said. In the 2nd week of the construction work, something happened. It happened on a Wednesday, which is one of those details that feels arbitrary, but that the ledger keeper in me insists on preserving because it was, in fact, a Wednesday, and the day of the week is part of the documentation. A man arrived at the construction site looking for Callum. I wasn't there. I'm reporting what Callum told me and what the foreman confirmed when I asked him later. The man was, by all descriptions, unremarkable, medium height, dusty, wearing the clothes of someone who travels and has been traveling. He asked for Callum Dray by name. The foreman pointed. The man walked over. His name was Pollitt, and he was out of the Ocotillo Cross. Not the ranch itself. The ranch was gone, dissolved, its assets dispersed, and its land returned to whatever negotiation the owners had managed. But Pollitt had been one of the hands, one of the 4 who'd been standing in the yard on the morning it all ended. He'd gone east as Callum had gone west, and had found his way, through the specific gravity that frontier territory exerts on people moving through it, back toward the west again. He'd heard, through the lateral network of men who know men who know men, that Callum Dray was in Tucson. He'd come to find him. He had information. Specifically, there was a ranch to the west of Tucson, newly bought by a family out of California, that was hiring an experienced foreman. The salary was a foreman's salary, not a hand's salary, real money, steady money, the kind that changes the arithmetic not for a week or 3 weeks, but for a year, for longer. The ranch had a house. A real house with walls and a roof and the kind of permanence that distinguishes a home from a place to sleep. The California family had asked Pollitt if he knew anyone qualified. Pollitt had said he knew one person. Callum heard this. I reconstructed his face from the foreman's description and from what Callum told me himself, the thing behind his eyes doing its complex calculations, the ledger running the numbers at speed. A foreman position, real money, a house. And then Pollitt said, "One thing, the family's got a daughter who's got allergies. They can't do animals. No dogs on the property." Callum was quiet for a long moment. The foreman said he went back to work afterward, without saying anything else to Pollitt, and worked the remainder of the afternoon with the focused silence of a man who has been handed a problem he hasn't finished with. He came back to Cora's that evening. Reed was at the door. He sat down on the floor of the room, on the floor, not the cot, and Reed climbed into his lap, and he sat there for a long time without moving. He came to find me the next morning. We sat on the bench outside the freight office, the original bench, the one where I'd been sitting the morning he'd walked past the other bench, the bench with the puppy tied to it. He sat down beside me. Reed was in the sling. He told me about Pollitt. When he was done, I was quiet. The foreman's salary, the house, no dogs on the property. He looked at the main street. "What would you do?" he said. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. He was asking the ledger keeper, the man who follows stories and tracks the accounting. I thought about it for longer than I would usually think before answering. I thought about the bench outside Headley's. I thought about 43 cents. I thought about a temporary spoke on a desert road and a man saying you stopped as if that indexed everything necessary about a person. "I think," I said slowly, "that the question isn't what I'd do. I think the question is what it would cost you one way or the other." He looked at me. "Not money," I said, "the other kind." He was quiet again. Reed shifted in the sling, made a small sound, resettled. "I've done the math," he said. "I've done it about 15 times since last night." And he looked at Reed. The dog was watching the street with the magnificent disinterest of an animal that does not know it is the subject of an important calculation. "Both ways there's a loss," he said. "That's the thing, both ways I lose something." "Yes," I said. "But one of the losses," he stopped, started again. "One of the losses I'd know I made, the other one just happened to me, was done to me." He paused. "I've had enough of things being done to me." I entered it in my ledger that evening, in exactly those words. Because it was, I felt, one of those sentences that functions as a key to something, that opens a door you've been standing in front of without realizing. I've had enough of things being done to me. He told Pollitt no. He told me afterward, without drama, the way he told most things, as a fact, cleanly stated, offered without request for validation. Pollitt had taken it without argument, which speaks to something about Pollitt's character, or perhaps just about his understanding of Callum's. The construction job continued. Cora's yard continued to be investigated by Reed with scientific thoroughness. The ledger of Callum Dray's finances, which I tracked with the indirect attention of a man who has developed an investment in a story, continued to move in the right direction, not dramatically, not with the sweep of a reversal, but incrementally, as things that are fundamentally sound tend to move when they're given time. 3 weeks, the construction job paid. He settled the debt at Cora's with some remaining credit that she declined to convert to cash because, she said, he'd fixed 2 of her fence posts on a Sunday without being asked, and that was worth something. He had enough. Not a lot, not a foreman's salary, but enough. At the end of the 3rd week, on a Saturday, he came to find me again. He sat down on the bench. "There's a cattle drive forming," he said. "Foreman's a woman named Desert who runs a tight operation and pays honest. They need an experienced hand who can also work the dogs." He looked at Reed, who had grown in 3 weeks into something that more closely resembled the large dog she would eventually become, the paws still oversized, the ears still slightly too ambitious for her head, but her body beginning to catch up with her ambitions. "She can work." "Reed." "She's been working Cora's chickens all week," he said. "Cora says she's got instinct." I looked at Reed. Reed was sitting beside Callum's boot, the whole boot, the repaired boot, with her chin on his knee and her eyes on the street, in the posture of a dog that has settled into her permanent assignment and sees no reason to discuss it further. When does it leave? I said. Monday. I nodded, ran the numbers in my head, not the money numbers, those I trusted him to have already run, but the other ledger, the one that tracks different quantities. You'll come back through, I said. He looked at me, something in his face that was a question about why I was asking. Story's not done, I said, which was true but not the full truth. The full truth was closer to what my mother had told me about the hawk in the field, about watching. Some things you watch because they're instructive, some things you watch because they're rare. He almost smiled, the partial rearranging smile I'd seen once before. I'll come back through, he said. They left Monday morning. Callum and Reed and the drive's other hands, the wagon and the horses and the complicated ecology of a cattle drive forming up and finding its rhythm. I watched them go from the freight office. Reed was not in the sling, she was too big for the sling now, had been too big for several days, and was instead trotting alongside Callum's horse with the purposeful energy of a young dog that has recently learned what purpose feels like. Her ears, still slightly too large, flagged back and forward with each stride, reading the air. The drive turned south at the end of the main street, where Tucson's buildings give way to the territory's insistence, and then they were out of sight. I took out the ledger. I looked at the entry for the morning on the bench, C. Dray. 43 cents minus Navarro's, puppy under Headley's bench, cracked boot, no address, no plan beyond west. I looked at the last entry, cattle drive deserts operation, Reed Shepherd mix healer instinct according to Cora, boot repaired, debt settled, Monday. I sat with it for a while. A man who had nothing, a dog that had been left, a bench and a rope and a small sound that cut through the particular fog of a man's exhaustion and said, I am still here. And a man who stopped. I want to be careful about how I conclude this, because the ledger keeper in me resists false precision, resists the clean ending that tidies the numbers into a sum they don't naturally form. The cattle drive went well. I know because Callum came back through Tucson 2 months later. It was November by then, the desert having made its seasonal adjustments from hot to cool in the abrupt way of desert climates, and stopped at the freight office. He looked different, rested in a way that wasn't just sleep but something longer, a resting that accumulates from weeks of work that suits you. He'd grown a proper beard which suited him, and he had money in his pocket that was not counted in cents. Reed was with him. She was, by November, unmistakably herself, a large, sharp, attentive dog of the shepherd healer variety, with the coloring she'd apparently decided on after weeks of consideration, something tawny and gray with a white chest and one white ear. She moved alongside Callum with the fluid, collected energy of a working dog that knows her job, and she looked at me with the expression she apparently reserved for people Callum had told her were acceptable, which was an expression of comprehensive assessment followed by measured tolerance. He told me about the drive, about dessert, who was exactly as he'd described her, tight operation, honest pay. About the cattle and the country they'd moved through, and a night near the Santa Cruz where a mountain lion had come close enough to the herd to cause a situation that Reed had addressed with a focused, fearless aggression that had surprised everyone including, apparently, the mountain lion. About the other hands, and the cook, and the particular society of a cattle drive that forms and dissolves and reforms along the miles. He talked about it the way people talk about experiences they've absorbed rather than endured. At some point I said, "What's next?" He was quiet. Outside the freight office window, Tucson was doing its late November thing, the air carrying the first real edge of cold, the light thinner and more angled than it had been in September. "There's a ranch," he said. "South-southwest, 2 days' ride, smaller operation, owners getting older, looking for someone to manage it over the long term." He paused. "They've got existing dogs, old working dogs, experienced, would need someone who knows how to bring a new dog into an established pack." He looked at Reed. Reed was sitting beside him, her white ear forward, watching me watch her. "I think she can do it," he said. "I think so too," I said. He stood up, shook my hand, the handshake of a man who has decided you're in the ledger under a category that means something, that you're not just a witness but a something else, though neither of us was going to name it with more precision than that. He went out to his horse. Reed went with him. He swung up into the saddle and she took up her position alongside, the two of them with the quality of things that have found their arrangement and settled into it without negotiation. He looked back once, "That's a good story," he said. "Whatever you write in that ledger." Then he turned south. I sat down on the bench. The bench where I'd been sitting the morning it started. The bench that was just a bench, that had no particular significance except as the vantage point from which a ledger keeper had watched a man in a cracked boot walk past another bench with a puppy tied to it. I opened the ledger. I looked at the entries. Then I turned to a new page. I thought about how to summarize it, which is a ledger keeper's instinct, to find the line that captures the account in its essential form before the page is closed and the next one opened. 43 cents, a puppy under a bench, a rope untied. A foreman's salary declined. A mountain lion deterred by one dog with one white ear. A ranch south-southwest, 2 days' ride, needing someone for the long term. The entry I wrote was not about money in the end. It was not about the accounting of what he'd had and what he'd gained, the neat before and after of a story that resolves. What I wrote was shorter than that. I wrote he stopped, everything else followed from that. I don't know if that's entirely true. The ledger keeper in me insists on noting that it's a simplification, that it compresses the spoke repair and Sela's wren's sister and Cora's yard, and the mountain lion, and all the incremental accumulations into a single cause and effect that may be philosophically tidy, but is narratively incomplete. But I also think, and I've thought about this in the months since, in the way I think about entries that haven't settled yet, that some simplifications are true in the way that matters. Not accurate exactly, but true. He had nothing, the puppy had been left. He stopped, and then everything else.